Evening, good evening, and families that are participating on the Zoom link provided tonight. I have known Dr. Gwen when she was a Mount Ohio student, and she's a class of aging myself. And she continued her educational path to Ohio State University for sports management. Also, UMass Amherst school counseling, and then received a PhD in special education. Truly a remarkable life path so far. Gwen continued reaching goals and challenging primitive thinking around education because thriving kids depend upon empowered adults and helping adults navigate and learn about the possibilities and some of her trainings that she has done. 10 years in pre-K to 12, which we do have our academy here, in education, 10 years in teaching education. Also, research for foster parent training. The list goes on and on. And there's looking more and more on the website. Gwen finished the manuscript for her book, Immaculate Misconception, which is going to be actually finished up the manuscript today, didn't you? I think it was posted today. Posted today. Yes, congratulations on that. And then the book will be printed in June of 2023. I will be purchasing a book, and it's going to be dedicated to our library. And I'm grateful for this wonderful opportunity for Gwen to be here with her family. And I hope you enjoyed her presentation this evening. Dr. Gwen.
This is my first in-person book reading for Immaculate Misconception, and I'm really excited to be here. Special thank you to Kelly for facilitating this event. Kelly and I first met 2 decades ago when I was a student at Mount Ohio, and she was working with public safety. And we met because I had a really egregious number of parking tickets. And after my car was like booted on campus, and I paid way more money in fines than I really paid for rent, the college was kind enough after threatening to ban my car to like put me on a rehabilitation plan. And that involves doing a parking appeals board. Which is where we met monthly and talked about other people's ticket appeals and decided to Instagram. And Kelly was on it with. So since then we worked together in a few different capacities. But I suppose I should thank you not only for bringing me here tonight, but also for not writing me off completely for my blatant disregard for tickets. All right. During our time together this evening, I thought I would tell you a little bit about why I wrote my book, and I share a few excerpts from the book. And then I'm happy to just answer questions. So I'll start by saying that I never really expected I would be standing here tonight, sharing from my own memoir. I never thought I would write a memoir, and I thought my days of speaking publicly about my family were over. Despite the anti-gay legislation that continues to threaten the safety of their people and their families, the world that I grew up in as a child of lesbian parents is vastly different from the world my kids are being raised in. I regularly stood in rooms like this one, before crowds of college students, before parents, when I was a kid. There weren't other families like mine, and I was a mini spokesperson for the queer family group. I was tasked with assuring people that I was okay, that lesbian moms were okay, and I played that role throughout my childhood. But by the time I got to college, I really wanted nothing to do with public proclamations that had anything to do with my parents' sexuality or my family work. As I've written this memoir, I've thought a lot about my aversion to sharing information about the fact that my parents were lesbians. Part of the reason for it is because as one of the first kids raised, I felt like a major responsibility to turn out straight, and I didn't. But I still carry with me the feeling that if I tell people my parents are queer too, they'll think, oh, of course, you're gay. Whether or not that's an outdated assumption, it's a form of internalized homophobia. So being here tonight is really like a throwback moment for me. To all of the college lecture halls I've stood in, talking about my experience growing up. I've never done that as an adult, and so I'll start by reading an excerpt from the introduction of my book, and then I'll share a bit more about how this book came to be, and then I'll read the book. And it's always like really funny for me as an educator to like stand before you and not actually try to engage you fully. But I really want to feel like you can ask questions. All right, so this is from the introduction. Being conceived through artificial insemination is a fun thing. My existence, quite simply, is the result of a medical intervention that can be characterized as a substitute for the real deal. Even the term artificial suggests some level of ignorance. Regardless how expansive your definition of family, it's physically impossible for two women to make a baby without a man. But what happens when that man is in death? My parents, Lois and Judith, were among the first lesbian couples to have a baby through artificial insemination with an unknown donor. And I was born into a bit of an experiment. When they consented to the only viable option for getting pregnant at the time, they simultaneously agreed to forego access to any information about my maternal lineage. I grew up with two loving caregivers, two sets of relatives, and half a family tree. I regarded my donor as a means to an end for my actual needs. A biomedical proxy rather than a human. He was the artificial one, not me. And as a child, his missing pieces felt inconsequential. Navigating the very real complexities that come with being the first of my kind is what took priority. I was in my mid-30s when Judith began to hear from old friends, also lesbians, that their kids had found biological siblings through mail-in DNA tests. They sent me a kit, accompanied by a gentle nudge to see what might happen. I dragged my feet for months before finally spitting into the vial and tucking it in the mail. Meanwhile, Judith texted me photos of her friends' daughters and the siblings they had discovered on Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Remarking at the shocking resemblance I shared with one of the candidates. By the time I eventually sent in the test, it apparently waited so long that it had expired, rendering my sample unanalyzable. The company sent me a second one and I did the process all over. Again, I received the result, my specimen couldn't be analyzed. Maybe I hadn't inherited a good fit. I took it as a sign that this wasn't a tree I needed to mark up with any urgency. What difference would it make if I shared DNA with strangers or with even so many little friends? Judith and Lois lived in a suburb outside Ann Arbor, Michigan. Judith was an early childhood development expert and consulted with travel internationally for meetings and site visits, while Lois worked in a local school as a counselor. Together, they had been raising Judith's son Dan from her previous marriage to a man. Lois was desperate to have a baby of her own, and Judith was eager to give her 11-year-old son a sibling. In 1980, the landscape for lesbians who wanted to get pregnant was booming. The few sperm banks that provided the service to unmarried women required prospective mothers to undergo comprehensive psychological evaluations. Homosexuality was still slowly phasing out of the DSM. Women who had divorced their husband, now as gay, were losing custody of their children, and the handful of clinics that offered artificial insemination primarily served heterosexual couples. The notion of a family with two female parental figures was completely new, historically speaking. The popularization of sperm banks and donor registries didn't begin for nearly another decade, and the possibility that a child could have two moms was lacking. It wasn't safe for many gays and lesbians to be out of the workplace or in schools, and people didn't know how that would translate to a Lamaze class or a delivery room. While Roe v. Wade had recently secured a woman's right to choose not to be pregnant, the political tone did not favor single mothers or the idea that an unmarried woman could choose to become pregnant. After months of searching, they found a doctor who agreed to perform the insemination under one condition, that they never request record of the procedure or seek information about the donor's identity. Dr. Taylor believed it was not his right to deny them a baby, but he dealt solely in cash, relied on sperm donations from men in his network, and noted only a routine physical examination from Lois's file. My parents agreed to the terms, to the ambiguity, and to the secrecy. Once I was conceived, they referred several lesbian couples to the doctor, who gave each woman a slightly different story about their respective donor. He's blonde, he's Jewish, he's tall with an olive complexion, he's adopted. Aside from the dominant heterosexual paradigm, there was no model or language for them to rely on in formulating their opinion. Amid preparing a nursery, choosing between cloth and disposable diapers, and debating the pros and cons of purchasing a microwave to warm bottles, Lois and Judith decided I would not be raised by two moms. Instead, Lois would be the mom, and Judith would be the other parent. Lois would be linked to me on school forums and would carry me on her medical insurance, and would be, in legal and technical terms, her child. Since Judith was already her son's mom, this made sense to her. Of course, she too would raise me, not as a mom or a dad, but as Lois's partner and my other parent. Establishing the division also offered them a sort of cover that could be used as needed. For the first years of my life, I didn't know any families like mine, as the road to building a queer family had yet to be paved. I grew up surrounded by chosen family and biological relatives, and my upbringing was imbued with conviction that family extends beyond our DNA. By the time I entered preschool, I was an unwitting spokesperson for the gay movement. As a kid, I straddled two worlds. At home, I lived with my non-traditional family, but in the wider world, I lived in everyone else's heteronormative reality. By bridging the gap, I was living proof that kids with lesbian parents could turn out okay. I defended my relationships to my non-biological relatives and rejected the notion that I needed to know my artificial dad to feel like a gay person. My family was different to the world, but it was all I knew. I spent my childhood playing with Cabbage Patch Kids, shooting hoops, cherishing my slap racing collection, and sitting on panels at conferences and graduate classes. How did my experience for prospective parents and community skeptics that it's okay for gays and lesbians to raise children? I was taught that love makes a family, not DNA, and felt as deeply connected to my non-biological parent and brother as I was to my biological mom. Questions about the donor's identity took a backseat, and navigating life as the first family of our kind took precedence. I never lacked the nourishment I needed to develop a strong sense of self. The disconnect between my personal life and the outside world reaffirmed what I believed, that I was alone in my experience, code switching in ways my peers couldn't quite understand. Over time, my parents lost touch with many of the women they referred to Dr. Taylor, so the discovery that some of us were related came as a bit of a shock. Along with the passing of marriage equality, the increase in LGBTQ+ representation in the media and protections for LGBTQ+ people, families like mine are now commonplace. While recent legislation in both ways which can threaten the safety of LGBTQ+ people, parents today have choices about how they build and secure their families. Yet many of the questions that my parents grappled with 4 decades ago are still relevant with their parents. Who will carry the child? How will we protect the non-childbearing parent's rights to the child? What will the child call us? What is our comfort level with a known versus an unknown donor? Is donor sibling contact a good thing? Should we call the donor or the father? Regardless of how far we've come, raising children as LGBTQ+ people is inherently in conflict with the societal ideal that children have a mother and a father. There will always be a question for kids about their missing biological parent or parents, even if for the purpose of understanding their own conception. I always imagined that the traits that differentiated me from my mom and my other parent must have come from him. Perhaps you're living with a similar sense of not knowing what maybe your child is. There is so much more to us than meets the eye. This book is for anyone who navigates the world with untold stories that live beneath the surface. While I didn't set out to write a memoir, signs that it was time to share my life story were everywhere. I began to see how my conception, upbringing, and family finding directly influenced who I am today, from how I built my own family to the professional life I have dedicated myself to, working with kids whose families and identities exist outside of tidy, normative storylines. By 37 years old, I had raised a family, was married and divorced, and didn't register my lack of connection to my paternal lineage. Unexpectedly finding biological siblings and learning about my donor has provided a context for parts of me that was previously awareness, and it has completely shifted my understanding of me. A flurry of new questions about my identity and belonging have emerged. What happens when you're born into an identity you choose? What does biology have to do with belonging? How do we all, in our own ways, suppress unique aspects of our identity to fit in and secure our safety? How do we unintentionally harm others by assuming they fit into our view of life? I ask these questions in the book by looking back at my life story and the sliver of queer history I was born into. Each chapter begins with a common query I noted as a kid. The anecdotes I share are based on my own accounts of events and conversations that took place, as well as stories I've been told over the years. I don't claim to speak for everyone who can speak for artificial insemination. This book is about my experience. More families in pop culture and day-to-day life look like mine, yet their honest stories remain mostly untold. While so much has changed since I was a kid, the impact of being different still makes a mark on anyone in a non-traditional family. Kids of queer parents still code switch between home and school to survive in mainstream society. A growing community of queer people are building families and making decisions about donor registries, sibling contact, and the role of biological family. In sharing my story, I hope to offer insight into some of the issues these non-heterosexual families may be battling. Connecting with my half-siblings is not threatened by deep enduring relationships with my family of origin. It has allowed me to know myself more fully. Many of us, queer or not, are in a lifelong process of negotiating how nature and nurture, the known and the unknown, contribute to our sense of self. This story is for you too. It turns out I am who I am because of my nature and how I was nurtured, and I'm equally grateful for it. So in the book, I write about how I found my siblings and my donor. I'm not going to read those sections tonight, but I'll say this. As I write the passage that you just read, I really did spend a lifetime defending the bonds I share with my chosen family, and the belief that my family wasn't dependent on DNA. And I built my own family through adoption. It wasn't really until 4 years ago that I connected with my paternal side and hadn't ever thought that would be possible. So all of that code switching between values and queer family and the norms of the outside world, all of that experience I had to do as a kid was an experience that I couldn't have imagined anyone else having. But some of my siblings had that same experience. And for me, that was the first time that part of my identity was a place where I belonged. And so knowing that I wasn't alone and that they really got it, what it was like explaining where you come from, because nobody had ever heard of artificial insemination, gave me the courage to want to come back into a room like this and talk about my experiences in hopes that someone else who sits on the outside, you might hear something that makes them feel like this. So I want to give you a little bit, and then I put the one more back to just questions, if you know what I mean. But I want to give you like a little bit of a flavor of what the book is like. And like I said, it starts with these anecdotes about experiences I had as a kid, and then it's really fun. So I'm going to share one that took place when I was in preschool from a chapter called Resilient Family. Kathy stepped out of the kitchen where she'd been making a snack and walked to the middle of the playroom. She rang her triangle 3 times, a signal to us preschoolers that we should stop what we were doing and listen for her announcement. The snack didn't smell like anything I wanted to eat, so I didn't bother looking up. Put your carpet squares over to the circle. It's time for morning meeting, Kathy said in a loud sing-song voice. My babysitter had taken me to McDonald's the night before, but my mom wouldn't let me bring the toy I got to school. I lifted my eyes from my Play-Doh creation, which only vaguely resembled the Happy Meal swag I've been recreating from memory, and remembered it was my turn to be our class hers. I stuffed the dough back into the container and headed over to retrieve my piece of carpet from the stack. I plopped the rubber square between Meredith and Sarah, so I had easy access to the tank and sat cross-legged, waiting for my moment to shine. In preschool, feeding the class pets was right up there with checking the weather on the list of the most desirable helping dogs, and I've been waiting weeks for my turn. Christmas is coming soon, and after we your staff, we're making special gifts for our families, Kathy explained once we were all gathered. She held up a reindeer made of clothespins and a candle decorated with colorful wax balls. Before we do our morning jobs, we're going to talk about the people in our family, so you can let me know which supplies we'll need to make the crafts. I wish she would have left the googly eyes and the colored rocks on the table, but she was afraid we'd make a mess. Why not just set the materials in piles without insisting on explaining what we received our holiday gifts? Maybe she was trying to open dialogue about how all families are unique, but it felt like mine was the only that invited any diversity to the conversation. The wind came slowly out of my excited to feed the turtles' sails. Here we go again, I thought, another boring conversation about family. I took a deep breath, ready to listen patiently as we went around the circle, so all the Merediths and Sarahs and Sams could talk about their mommies and their daddies and their sisters. I knew when it was my turn to say who was in my family, some kid would ask a question. Someone always asked a question. What about your dad? Sam might ask. I waited for Kathy to say something like, not every kid lives with their dad. Then Meredith would probably chime in and explain in a bossy voice that her parents were divorced, but she went with her dad on weekends. But she was still going to make a special candle and decorate it with blue and green, his favorite colors. Sometimes that would lead to everyone announcing their dad's favorite colors, and the conversation would end. but not always. Other times, like today, I hear another layer of questions. Are your parents divorced? Do you see your dad on weekends? I would have to explain all about artificial insemination, how I didn't know my dad because he wasn't really a dad at all. He was a donor, and my mom used his sperm to make me. My parents taught me the combinations of words I needed to understand where I came from, but I hadn't even thought to wonder about what my classmates did. That's so weird. I can't believe your mom doesn't even know your dad. Don't all moms and dads at least know each other? Do you wish you knew him? Were you ever seen him? What do you do on Father's Day? I live with my mom and dad, I live with my mom and Juju and Dan. I just thought, what's Juju? They would ask. Who's Dan? All families are different and special in their own ways at the end of the day. Dan's my brother, and Juju is my other parent. Well, Juju is short for Judith, which is her real name, instead of echoing my parents and talking. What's an other parent? Does your brother know your dad? He has a different dad. I tried to explain it. It wasn't that I didn't love my family or that I was mad my parents were lesbians, but I was jealous of how easy my classmates seemed to have it. When they named their reindeer and handle recipients, nobody looked confused or asked them what the dad was. Thinking back now, the idea of a 4-year-old schooling her peers and her teacher on the ins and outs of artificial insemination seems ludicrous. It was like my family could be best described using a language that a few people spoke. I had the vocabulary, but I was still making sense of what all the words meant. I could say Judy's name, but continued to call her Juju as I lived with her when I was still learning to speak. A few other kids I knew had lesbian parents who had previously been married to men. They had fathers to make things for in school age too. Dads with actual names who come up from school sometimes, so their friends could see how real they were. I remember envying that they could hide in ways I couldn't. The differences in their families could be overlooked. Mine always took center stage. I didn't blame my peers for not getting it. How could they? Most grown-ups I encountered put forth a similar line of inquiry. I barely understood it all. I responded to the morning meeting interrogation as best I could, without tuning in. Meanwhile, hoping the teacher would quickly change the subject or tell my classmates that they were born for having dads. I'm gonna stop there, but this chapter kind of goes on to explain some of the dynamics like broken hammers. And it's like, at the time, it was seen as like a very like progressive community and like used tolerant and influence because that was sort of like the violence that we tolerate all kinds of diversity. And so in that community, it was like both the bad and honor to like have something different about you. So cool. But for me, and in some ways that was great, like it could have been a lot worse. But I think it also made it so that my what was different about me was always really obvious. And you know, I did a lot of stuff. And the feeling of, oh my God, it's so cool when people are like, thanks for offering us in the chapter I talked about, like kind of being dinner table conversation for other things. Like, oh, we have this kid in our daughter's class who has gay parents and this is going to be both. And you know, we didn't have those conversations yet. So we didn't anyway, so again, the things that sort of like made me feel kind of different as a kid are very much part of the reason why I haven't really spoken much about the fact that I come from lesbians, especially as a gay person. That's why I have to take out a change title of a different ideal moments. And I guess I'll just say that as I got older, my world sort of grew older. So when I was 5, my non-biological parent moved to Geneva, Switzerland. And so the whole sort of experience that I had growing up in Massachusetts and sort of trying to understand and navigate social norms was vastly different across the ocean, in a place where I didn't speak the language, and she couldn't acknowledge that she was my parent because she was a job. So it was a lot there. Yeah, I feel like I want to stop and see if people have questions, and I'll also just say, like, as I said, I've been doing this my whole life, so I didn't really ask me anything about my experience, and I'm happy to talk about it. You know, if my kids are there, so just like,
well, first, I gotta say I'm offended to you for something that I appreciate and remember what I did last week. So thank you for sharing that. But I have had some we've been doing run high five presentations there, and I've been doing this one. And it's sad to think that this is part of their reality. My question to you is, what is your hope for your children? Based upon what you do on that side, and what is your hope for that moving forward?
It's a really good question. And I like have my answer for it now, and hopefully we'll have this most of the time. I think one of the things that's really important to me is that, and this is for my kids and other kids too, is just like having a really positive and clear narrative about who you are and where you come from. Because I think that there's a lot of things, there's a lot of ways that we don't actually address or talk about difference. And kids are aware of things about that. For me, like when I reflect back for all the bizarre things that happened in my life, and like my parents gave me language to talk about who I was, and it made me feel confident and being like, okay, listen, the world might not be ready for you, but like that doesn't mean that there's a problem. And so I think that's what I want them is to feel like they have the language to talk about who they are. Until they know what's right about that, maybe, you know, whatever is like most challenging. And that they feel like they know who they can go to not like to access support if they're and then
I have kind of a question. I'm having this crazy like transference moment with you. My best friend growing up, like the kind of best friend that like you're, I'm gonna marry him. I'm never gonna marry him, you know. He's exactly like you, like child of 4 brothers, same sperm donor, all of them. Idea. You know, the same kind of like, you know, only kid in the class right now, like also kind of like a liberal kind of, I don't know, I feel like I understand a lot of your story through my life experience. And I didn't expect that that was what this topic would be about. Actually, I think we're very ambiguous terms.
I'm happy to like balance in some other way.
I've heard, I think this was like a biology of gender class, or a lecture, and I was wondering if it was going to be like transphobic or not actually. So that's why it came. I was like, I don't know, I wanted to see what we go. But it was very pleasant sometimes because I felt like I connected with you as a writer. I thought that for a moment that you were a author, disappointed that you were, but you have a great speaker to have here. It hopefully makes sense. Yeah. Not really a question, I guess.
No, but actually like what, you know, and I didn't read the passage, but how about it? Like, you know, my own gender identity has been a really interesting process in the context of growing up with my parents, and then like, you know, like I have all these like men's pants where like lesbian mom friends who like these men's pants, right? But like lesbian mom friends who like I have this one sense of like how you become a gender in my house and then I would go into the world. Actually, one of the chapters is called I Am a Girl because like I still ask that question all the time. Anyway, so but like my relationship, like you know, and I don't want to like I want to be careful what I say, but I grew up in like a very like women, like my parents were very much like women with a Y, like you know, and very women, like you can be a woman no matter what you look like. And I think for me that was like actually really important and valuable. Like had I grown up in that dynamic 20 years later, would I have like had a different gender identity? Maybe. But it was in somebody recently that asked me how I identified, and they were like surprised that I could identify as queer. And they were like, do you identify as lesbian? I said, no, I don't identify. I'm like really averse to that word because I feel like my maybe from my parents. But I identify as gay, and they were kind of like, oh, does that like have to do with your gender? Or like, what's that about? I'm like, yeah, it kind of does, and it also feels like a little bit of like it wasn't like the language of queers in the context of my experience. Yeah, so like it's not the word, they don't have time, like I prefer myself, like there was which surprises me.
Yeah, no, but I totally think that the reason that I identify as a transgender man right now is because, wow, I didn't expect to do self-disclosure. I plan to talk to you after the talk.
Like, just pretend you're not here.
All the time because I'm sending drugs to always self-disclosure in the class, but like I think I identify as a transgender man now because of the generation before it. I also grew up watching like the L Word and like I'm very attached like lesbian and identity, but I think at least like growing up as a child of lesbian is like I don't know, I like You just knows a lot about yourself. I feel like I don't know, have a limited understanding of you, but it makes sense to me, you know, and I think that like, I make sense to me also. It's very interesting, yeah.
But I appreciate it. And actually, one of the this is also what I do.
I bet it is, I'm gonna buy a book.
I think you have information in the memoir, and how long did it take you to do that?
Like I started this process last spring. I went through a book writing program that basically teaches you like a 6 months to a year process of coming up with your idea for your book, and figuring out how to write it, and publicizing it and all that. And what I thought I was going to write was a book about my professional work with families, and I do a lot of work around supporting kids who experience trauma. And it's great. This is going to be this book about working with caregivers in schools and whatever. And then they were like, writing your inspiration story. And I'm like, I don't know, I have too many letters, not too many. Like I was in school for a long time. I've written millions of stories about like why I'm interested in what I do. But something about this like sort of hit me different. I was like, why do I really care about like these, maybe it's just like marginalized youth, the people who tend to get pushed out of systems. Why am I so interested? It's like, oh yeah, you know, there's an connection to that. Somehow like never dawned on me before. So that's like where this all emerged. And my mom actually passed away last December, which I think sort of freed up some space for me to be able to write it. But I basically wrote it sort of June and
And honoring your parents.
Yeah. I like, I hope they feel the same when they read the book, because it's, you know, like for as sort of like courageous and awesome as relationships, they were both courageous and awesome and also people. And so like our family had all the same stuff that I didn't recognize. Yeah, and there's like, I mean, there's been some interesting conversations about some sort of consistent issues in like the in terms of some of the stuff that gets played out. Anyway, yes, I feel like a stronger person having written this. I feel like the relation, again, like I said, the relationships that I have with my siblings really feel to me like possible. Yeah.
It's frustrating. To so in medical field, such as tends to think of things from that perspective. And I also just into between certain places that where in the community. Just wondering how your mother kind of felt like genetic lyrics or like how they.
So I was kind of curious too, like once I met my siblings, I was like, how many years are there? Not that like and many of them, it's interesting, like many of them grew up with weird parents. But not all of them. Some of them didn't even live with a lot of situation. Until they went into history and that interaction. But here, like people often assume that like my experience of coming out was really easy because my parents were open and actually really good. And I talked to my sister about it, like it was hard because we did feel a lot of pressure to like really started to come. And so yeah, so so like in the book I write this story about coming out at 5 and my mom being like, oh, you change that here. Like maybe not yet. Like you don't, maybe you just, and I remember like you look to the right, maybe don't have any more stories to give people, and so like that's what I am because like that's my community. It turned out like wasn't the case, and I tried really hard not to be, but like it didn't. But yeah, I feel like the nurture part made it like okay, and my parents have sort of been very taught on like all this stuff that happy with their word with them. And I don't think it's made it we're super supportive. But the process together was and one of my parents was like, I guess gay parents do make babies. So you didn't see that.
I'm thinking about for the generation and your mother, the kind of things that you feel like or 50, like sort of the generation where we got right by being good.
Yeah.
I think like when I was good at people, this is sort of like the nice gay guys from the Midwest, right? We made everyone less scared of gay people, but there's things you give up in that. And it sounds like you were kind of part of that as a child with like gay people were fine movements. And because I have sort of mixed feelings about the kind of something like was there the impression to be perfect because of the stimuli that maybe on display, or how did that, and did that like, was that conscious in your way that was what happened when you went on presentations and what was different, or like rearranging it now?
Yeah, there was, it's hard to say what is a function of my parents' internalized homophobia and what was a function of them as like people from high achieving families. Like I couldn't tell you the different, what was what, but definitely, and what I'll say is like, I think a lot of my life has been spent like, let me achieve in all these conventional ways. And I think that again is part of why I haven't talked about. I'm like, I don't make no, I mean, obviously who I am, and people can make whatever assumptions and I'm not hiding it. And if people ask me, I answer it and I talk about my family, but I don't really like talk about identity a lot. I don't press this forward because I feel like I don't want to be like no one has people the word using it. You know what I mean? Like I really want to I really just want to be seen for who I am in terms of contributions. But there's definitely been a high lot in terms of like, I try to achieve in every dimensional sense. I think you're right. I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, it's kind of been part of it. So like to your question about like do you think like proud of yourself for doing this? Like I think this has been a step towards like all those conventional ways in which I can achieve all those conversations I can be part of. But also I'm a good person. And I don't know. I wish I could say I follow rules better now. Sorry. I don't think you know that right. That's how she gets to know the student. That works.
It's not a negative.
No, actually, I was thinking about that. I think my mom came in with me when I was getting Danny from Canada. She's like, look at how much you got. Like, of course they are. It's not her soldiers. Send it, Mom. Anybody have any other questions?
Thank you for sharing your book with us. We very much appreciate it. I want to bring it. If I order it through you, right? Yeah. Can I get one signed for you?
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you. You have no.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So I'll just put this up at my.
So there were
Would you like that?